Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well today. This time we are going to be talking about The Origin of the RPG by Lord RPG. This is a self-published book, and yeah, it needs a lot of work to become good. The book has some good ideas. The author has a lot of passion for the subject, and those two things can get you pretty far in writing a book. But in this case, it needs a lot of stuff done to it in order to become, in some cases readable, in other cases just being good. I'm assuming it's a man who wrote this. He spent a lot of time writing this. He spent a lot of time doing research on it. But the problem is, there's no real structure to this book, and he really desperately needs an editor because a lot of his problems are not just, they're not just what he's trying to do. It's just creating a flow to it and telling a story. Those are the parts where he kind of falls apart, and it falls apart in a big way. Other history books that I've read, they tell a story of a certain subject, or they tell a story about a person who is responsible for that thing. And they start off with, usually they'll start off with the person who's important to the subject, or the person who kind of inspired another person who did something. And they sort of build off from that. That's one way to kind of show the reader the impact of what history is, or the impact of the story that you're trying to tell. And we get some of that here, but it's not really presented in a coherent enough way for it to really matter. The author doesn't cite any of his sources either, so all of the stuff that should have a citation attached to it, it's just not there, but I'll get into that later. I also couldn't see how the introduction part really mattered for the rest of the book. He brings up William Jameson and a lot of his studies into turning play into a form of leading, or a form of learning, and that's just not followed up on for the rest of this book, and it's not good. He really needs to kind of go through and rethink a lot of the things that he has in here, because I think all the parts are there. I think everything that could turn this into a good book is there. But yeah, the author really needs to kind of sit down and think about what he's doing, just so this thing can turn into what it's supposed to be. And let me just talk a little bit about what this book could be. Because, like I mentioned, I think there's something here. This book could be something where you explore the origins of play in general. How people think about, just the act of playing, how they use their imagination, that sort of thing. And how role-playing has gone from something that we do as kids, just thinking up a game and thinking up a set of rules and following those, to how it translated to people trying to recreate that in some way in the form of tabletop RPGs and also into video games as well. That's what I think this book could be, or it could have been. More of a looking at what the origin point of role-playing games as video games were, or what it is, and just kind of building off on that. I personally would not have gone as far into the 80s as the author did, because I don't think several of the games that he brings up are relevant to the story of what the origin of RPGs are. He starts off with Dungeons and Dragons, and I think that's a perfectly great start. And that should have been more of the book than what it was. And then he goes into a lot of the mainframe computers and the games that were created for those. And that was also a great idea. And we should have spent more time, honestly, in the 70s than we did. But a lot of those games aren't given as much aren't given as much space and as much time as I think they probably should have been. And that might just be him not finding as much information on them as he could, or at least what I think he might have done was try to reach out to the developers of those games, if they're still around, and maybe try to pick their brains on what was going on. And that can be hard to do when you're doing these self-published books, or you're doing something else. You don't have the street cred or anything like that to really get these interviews. But I think that is something that is needed in this. It really needed to be more of just an exploration of what the genre was, and not just a collection of stuff, because that's sort of what this is. He goes over a bunch of games, but there's no real, I'm not really seeing how they all connect, if that makes any sense. Part of the problem with that is that there are no goddamn sources in this book, or at least no sources for what should be sourced. He does have some footnotes for where he got the pictures from, and that's fine. I understand why he's doing that, but a lot of the information, all of the information is just kind of there. Like a word dump, if you will. It's not really, it's just sort of there, and we kind of have to take his word on it, that everything he's presented to us is true, or as true as he could find out about it. That's a bit of a problem with a lot of these. This isn't just an isolated incident. It's a problem with a lot of the self-published history books that have been produced over the years, especially with video games, where they'll say something that sounds a little crazy or sounds contradictory to what the overall narrative for certain things are, and you don't have any sources, so you can't go and research those. For most people, I should say for normal people, they're not going to care about the fact that there are no sources in this. Crazy people like me are going to care, because we want to make sure that these things are being presented to us in the right way, like they're not being taken out of context or anything like that. So, yeah, I understand why he maybe didn't include them all, because it wasn't important to him at the time. But if you're writing about the history and the origin of something, having the sources there is kind of necessary. I think there is some potential in this book. I think, like I mentioned, the author cares a lot about the subject, and he's trying to write a good book, and I think a lot of the pieces of a good book are there. I just don't think it's all the way it should be. Like, stuff is not presented in the way that it really should be presented in order for it to be a good book. And also, he really needs an editor for this, because things are just not really arranged in a way that make a whole lot of sense. In some ways, this book reminds me of the books written by Jamie Landino. The difference is Jamie's books are all much better written than this. They're structured much better, and there's more of a story that Jamie is telling. What he does is usually have an introduction to set up why the games that he's going to be presenting are important, or what happened during a specific time period. And then he goes into the game reviews that he has, or talks more about the games that he's selected for that specific period. I think that would help out this book an awful lot. If you had something that said, 1970s, and Then you go into the story of the games for the 70s. You talk about kind of what's happening in that period. And I think some of that is in here, but it's not arranged in a way that makes a whole lot of sense. Yeah, I wanted to like this book, but unfortunately it has too many problems for me to really sit down and enjoy it. If it was structured differently and if it was edited better, then I think it could have been a good book. Anyway, guys, that's going to wrap things up. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Bye.